Yep, it just cut out. There it is, it's cutting out. We got a 2008 Ford Ranger 2.3. Customer complaint is the vehicle's cutting out. You drive it and all of a sudden, vroom, it's almost like somebody just let off the gas pedal, but you're not. I drove this thing yesterday and I definitely reproduced the issue. So I come in this morning, I thought I'd make a little video in case anyone's having this issue. I do not know what's wrong with this thing. I literally just put a scan tool on it, and we are going to look at some PIDs, and that's data. PIDs are like you can see the sensors on a computer. Here are the PIDs we're looking at. Throttle position sensor, or voltage, and I've been hitting it. That's me hitting the gas pedal there, making sure you hit it real slow, make sure there's no dropouts, because when I drove this thing, it acts like something's, like almost just somebody's letting off the gas. The car doesn't quit, but I still need to recreate it while I have this connected. There's our math, grams per second, and I have the RPM. So I'm just gonna start with this, and we're gonna drive it. When it starts acting up, we're gonna try to catch it. Time for a test drive. And the prindle's broken. That's another issue. We're gonna worry about that later. What's this guy doing here? All right, here we go. Let's try to get it to do it. I know yesterday the engine was hot when it did it. It's definitely not warmed up yet. I don't know if that's a factor, but it did it. It cut out on me pretty good. But when it cuts out, the actual RPM goes down. So it's engine. It's definitely not transmission. So far, everything looks real good. And I will edit this video to the part where it starts messing up, so you don't have to watch the boring parts. Okay, so it just did it. I had to put on my 4-ways to make sure somebody didn't run into me. Let me see if I can get it to do it again. Well, it's definitely doing it. It's cutting in and out really bad. Definitely not the throttle position sensor. The pip signal's still switching. That's the ignition control, part of the ignition circuit. So what is cutting out on this thing? It's like the throttle's just closing on it. But it can't be, because the throttle position sensor is saying it's not. I mean, this thing is just cutting out. I've had to put on my 4-ways a whole bunch of times. If somebody gets behind me, I put on my 4-ways. But it's going down to about 1,000 RPM. When it cuts out. We're going to go back to the shop. This thing's crazy. And there's no codes. So, you know, a code would be nice. They point us in the right direction, but Fords, especially these older Fords, they really don't generate codes very well from my experience. Not like the newer vehicles. They'll generate codes pretty quick and give you an idea, or at least an arrow to point in the right direction. These older ones, no. So I'm gonna go back to the shop and probably just put a fuel gauge on, fuel pressure gauge, although I don't think that's what it is, but that's the next easiest thing to do. And see if the fuel's cut now. It's a possibility, but I don't know, we'll see. Well, I noticed, I was thinking about the fuel, and this oxygen sensor is just not reading correctly. I mean, it should be between like around 50 to 80 millivolts, switching back and forth. And then the downstream, I don't know what's up with it. It's like 132. I mean, they're regular zirconian O2 as far as I know. I know that's not right. All right, so I know these O2 sensors are not responding at all. It's in open loop, but you still should get a response from your O2 sensors because the downstream, so I got propane hooked straight up to the intake, and this should go rich. This is sensor 1, bank 1. There's only one bank on this because it's a 4-cylinder. So when I hit this gas, propane, nothing's changing at all. It tells me that the O2 sensor is definitely not working. Okay, it's the next morning, and I think where we left off was the O2s just don't seem to be working at all. I also noticed it's running an open loop. There's no codes at all. So this thing is getting to be quite a challenge. So I thought about this overnight. So I just want to do the easiest things first. You always want to do the easiest next step before you go deeper and deeper and deeper into the car. So the next easiest thing would be to just put a fuel pressure gauge on the fuel rail. This one does actually have a port to put the fuel pressure gauge on. So that's what we'll do next, and I'll get it to cut out again, and I'll see if that fuel pressure is dropping. Like I said, the O2s aren't working, but it's staying in open loop. It shouldn't cut out like that in open loop. It still should drive. Now, I'm not saying it won't, but from my experience, it still should drive fine. You know, it should not cut out. The manufacturers do not want to put an open loop is basically a default strategy that the vehicle uses in case it can't use the oxygen sensors or the MAF sensor to control the fuel and air. So it'll do something called, it'll stay in an open loop state as a default strategy so you can drive it safely. And so I don't think that's what's causing it to cut out. But anyway, enough talking. Let's hook the fuel pressure gauge up to it, and let's see if that fuel pressure is dropping out when it's cutting out. It's easy to do. We'll try that. Right here's the nipple, or the port, whatever you want to call it. Let me hook my fuel pressure gauge up to that, and I'll run it up here and try to set it to where I can see it through the windshield, and we'll go for a ride. Before we get started, this is the fuel pressure we're looking for, 48 to 70, so we really don't want to see it go below 48. I got the fuel pressure gauge hooked up, and it's up here where I can see it when we drive it. This thing only acts up when it's warm, so I'm going to start it up, let it get hot, and then we'll take it for a drive. All right, it's warmed up, and there's the gauge. It's over 60 PSI, which is plenty. I went ahead and graphed the MAF sensor. Although I've done that earlier, I didn't see nothing. I'm really just trying to concentrate on this fuel pressure. So let's take it for a rip. Okay, now we're driving trying to get it to cut out. It's doing it. Okay, it's cutting out. And the fuel pressure is staying rock solid. So that confirms it's not fuel pressure. Okay, I'm pulled over on the side of the road. I am going to unplug the MAF sensor and see if that helps. I'm just trying to do, like I said, the easiest things first before we get out of scope and all that. So I want to unplug the MAF. Now it may kill the engine. I'm not sure if it's using this MAF sensor in open loop. That lock tab was a pain in the butt. Alright, it's unplugged. Let's see how it does now. Well, it's definitely still cutting out. So that was just something easy to try. I didn't think it would help. Well, I'm back at the shop. Fuel pressure's not dropping out. Unplugging the MAF didn't help. I think it's time to break out the big guns. I'm gonna have to put a oscilloscope on this. Probably on the crank sensor. And possibly the injectors to see the pulse width and see if it's changing when it's dropping out, and probably coil spark to see if the spark is being controlled by the PCM, if it's slowing down the spark. I don't know. We'll find out. I'll hook everything up and bring you back when I get it all hooked up. This one is driving me nuts. I've already got about almost 2 hours on it. But we've eliminated a lot of things. So let's keep going. Okay, so I broke out the big guns and I hooked the scope up to the crank signal, the injector pulse, and also the spark plug firing event. I'll show you my setup. I got channel 1 on my CK sensor. It's a magneto reluctance, so you gotta probe into both wires to get a good signal. And I have channel 2 on cylinder number 1 injector. And I have channel 3 clipped to the spark plug wire on cylinder 1. So I'm getting in the truck. This is what it looks like running. I already took a steel capture. So what we want to do is when this truck messes up, one of these, this is for the fuel, that's the fuel control. This is the crank sensor. And this right here is the spark plug wire. So what are we losing? What's dropping out here whenever we get this hesitation or loss of power? So I'm going to drive it, and when it starts doing it, we're going to catch it, hopefully. Okay, I'm going to roll the scope, start it up. There we go, there's our signals. So let's drive it and see what happens. All right, we're driving. When it cuts out, let's see what we're losing. Yep, it just cut out. There it is, it's cutting out. We're losing spark. All right. We caught it. There it is, it's cutting out. It's doing it really bad now. That is fantastic. So we are losing spark. All right, I'm happy because we figured it out, but not all the way. All right, so I feel a lot better now, so we know why this thing is hesitating. Something awful. Literally the spark is just disappearing on it. And at this point, I don't know why, but what we're going to do is get on this one has a coil pack that has 2 coils within 1 unit, I think. Yeah. And could be wrong about that, but we're going to plug into the wires going into the coil pack. I think there's 2 control wires, and of course power and ground. So we're going to see what's going on there. Yeah, so that's the next thing we need to know. Hopefully it's either at this point a bad coil, a bad wire going to the coil, or a bad PCM, because the wires go straight to the PCM. It controls everything. This thing don't have a separate module on it. So I'll hook all that up. We'll re-roll the scope and see what interesting we can find next. Okay, these are the 3 wires I'm hooked up to. Okay, here's my setup. So I'm on the 3 ignition coil wires that go to the ignition coil. The blue trace, which is on the far end, it's coil control. The middle one is power. And from the diagram, the other one's coil control. Yeah, so right here is number 1, coil control, and number 2 is the middle one. It is a fuse, and number 3, coil control. Okay, here's our setup. We know that this is on our spark plug wire, and this is what we was losing. This red is just the power going to our coil pack, and the blue and yellow is our coil control. There it is. Absolutely nothing. Holy cow. We're losing the control completely. Right? Okay, so this is when the stall happens, and it looks like basically we lose control. There's no control going to the coil pack. The voltage, the power stays good. We just lose control. Oh, I hate this. I hate calling computers. Oh, I guess I'm gonna have to check control right at the computer and check powers and grounds. This thing, I don't think the crank sensor, the cam sensor, has anything to do with the... Could just unplug it and see what it does. Maybe I'll try that. because I just graphed the crank sensor. I did not graph the cam sensor. I'm going to read a little bit. When in doubt, just read stuff. Sometimes it'll give you some clues. Alright, I want to go read. This is what I found when I was sitting there reading. I'll show you guys. We were only testing the crank sensor. Most cars, they just use the crank sensor for their primary ignition timing. I think this one may be different according to this information. I'll show you. This is the camshaft, not the crankshaft. And if you read it, the cam sensor detects position of the camshaft. It identifies when piston number 1 is on compression stroke. A signal is sent to the PCM for synchronizing the firing of the fuel injector. This may not be it, because unless it's losing its synchronization, but I think this is just for startup. But we're going to have to check and make sure it's not dropping out. It did seem like it had a little bit of a long crank, so we'll check it out, see what we find, but you never know. It does use it to synchronize it. I would think if it lost its synchronization, it wouldn't shut them all off, but we'll see. All right, I got the crank, or not the crank, but the cam sensor in blue. So I'm gonna make sure it's not dropping out. Pretty sure that doesn't have anything to do with what's going on, but I'm just trying to be extra careful here before we call a computer. It's doing it now, and you can see the cam sensor still intact. No problem at all. All right, let's just look back at the cam sensor when it dropped out. Well, there it is. Yep, cam sensor's fine. You will never believe what I found so far. I'm not saying it's fixed yet, but I just want to keep you updated. Okay, so anytime you suspect a bad computer, which I think we've gotten that far, you always want to check your powers and grounds. So I'll show you my setup. I've been checking powers and grounds. This thing's got a bunch for a few minutes. So I'm checking all the powers and grounds with the meter and a test light to load them. And I got to this one, this fuse circuit breaker, check the power on that. And the craziest thing, so when I checked the power on it, it didn't have any power. Basically, no power. Now when I plug that computer in, it has like 22 volts. So let me plug it in. So you can see that's the first reading I got. I didn't film this as I go, but I want to show you what I found, because 24 volts, I mean, what the heck? I was thinking, is there some kind of back feed, something going on? So you can see my mess of wires I got here. I'm trying to figure all this out. Looking up, is this thing back feeding through some circuits? I'll save you the headache. Long story short, I come over here to the fuse box, and it says fuse 39 is responsible. So I is responsible for the power to that. So I go 39 and I count exactly 39. And there was no fuse in it, but there's no hangs for, there's not supposed to be a fuse because there's nowhere you can see the metal where it connects, or the receptacle. So I'm just sitting here staring at it. I'm thinking, am I looking at this thing right? So on this model, and I've seen some, I know Dakota does this, You have to look at this as if you're looking at it like this. Okay? So if you could see through it, 39's actually this one. You would think it'd be up here in that corner, but it's actually this one. And I looked, and there's a fuse missing, and it looks like there's some receptacles, terminals, to where a fuse is supposed to go in there. So I grab a 15 amp fuse and I put it in there. So there we go. Now I'm back to normal system voltage. Oh, these are the kind of things that drive you crazy when people pull fuses, because you really don't know if there's one supposed to be there or not. I mean, I've seen empty slots where there is receptacle where one plugs in, but there ain't supposed to be one. So anyway, I'm just going to drive this thing now and see if it does it again. I mean, that was a power feed to the computer. I mean, it has something to do with something. So hopefully it didn't mess the computer up. I'm going to drive it, see what happens. Well, I've been driving for about 5 minutes. I'm going to keep driving, and it has not killed out yet. So let's cross our fingers. I'm going to drive it back to the shop, go ahead and close up for the day, and then I'm going to drive this thing home just to be sure. But that is crazy if that's what that was the whole time. Let's not celebrate yet. All right, I drove this Ranger home last night and it did not act up a bit. Hopefully that fuse missing must have been the problem. This is crazy. I'm gonna drive it to work and we'll see. So I'm at my house. This is where I live. I'll show you. And you can't hardly see through the car. Here's my little box gardens. This is my home. It's got a basement, a full basement. It's not a real big home, but I got a fence around it. I got 2 young boys and a baby daughter, so they can't get out. I got a rain barrel over there. You can see it right there. And then we pour it on the garden. Yeah, pretty good little neighborhood. This is East Kentucky. Anyway, I'm gonna drive it to work. If anything happens, I'm gonna turn the camera on real quick. All right, we're back at the shop and that's it. I've drove this thing for miles and miles. We have fixed it. That is crazy, guys. I almost wanted to put a computer in this. Although the computer was the source, you always have to check your powers and grounds. How important was that in this case? When I seen that 22 volts on a power feed, I knew something was weird. And from experience, when you see a high voltage, it's a back feed. It usually means, it could mean a lot of things, but in my experience, it usually means there's a fuse missing. I've seen that like one other time. It's really rare, and it was years ago. So I'm super happy about this fix. This thing's been to other shops and they couldn't figure it out. And you know what? It was a tough one. It was, you know, I don't really blame them for not figuring it out. It was really tough. But if you just do your diagnosis in a step-by-step procedure, you know, you'll figure it out. And you got to have the right tools. I don't think if I would have used a scope on this, I don't think it would have led me in the direction that it led me in. It would have been really hard if I didn't. You know, I think it would have took longer. Maybe I would have figured it out eventually without a scope, but I'm so thankful. If you aftermarket guys, even dealership guys, you got to start using scopes. And I've only been using them for a couple years now, and lately The first year I was just really learning on a snap-on scope, and then I finally got a really good Pico, and I'll tell you, it's a game changer. And I'm still learning, but I've really dove deep and really tried my best to learn. But anyway, enough of me blabbing. Guys, I really appreciate you watching. I hope you got some benefit from this. I sure had a great time diagnosing this. It took a couple days, but yeah. All right, thanks for watching. Catch y'all on the next one.